Good evening, everybody. Hello, friends. I'm tuning in from Detroit, Michigan, but we have our guests piped in from all parts of California. I'm Dr. Nicordelai Corte, moderator of A More Perfect Union and chief national political analyst for KBLA Talk 1580, and really delighted to welcome you to this very special presentation this evening. It is the Agenda for California, an African American perspective. Now, you've been tuning in every Thursday for the past several weeks for a series of these conversations where we've talked about the state of Black youth, the state of Black women, the state of Black men, and why we can't wait. And so I am so delighted as a native Californian to be able to talk to some of the leading voices across the Golden State that are really powerful demonstrations of leadership for our country in these challenging times. I want to say happy election season to all of our leaders, learners, and listeners. And even though Election Day is November 8th, early voting and vote by mail is available in California and so many states across the country. Go to iwillvote.com to get the latest information that you need for you, for your family, for your loved ones, so that you can make your voice heard this midterm election. And if your family members are concerned about pocketbook issues, access to affordable health care, police reform and public safety, access to financial capital, ending the movement to ban Black history from school curriculums, and just tired of efforts to erase the contributions of our fellow LGBTQ Americans, don't sit this election out. Don't you do it. Democracy is on the ballot. And like a mighty stream, so many issues of importance to us are an outgrowth of the health of our democracy and the power of our vote. I want to start off by saying, as goes California, as goes the nation. We've heard that a number of times. We're going to really test the meaning of that during the course of these next 2 hours. But first, we've got to decide who represents us and prioritize the issues that matter most to our community. Black folks are not a monolith, and tonight's panelists understand this, and they govern accordingly. In our second hour, we'll hear from the chair of the LA County Board of Supervisors, Holly Mitchell, executive director of the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability, Paul Henderson, and public opinion researcher of Evictus, Sha'Carri Byerly. But first, in this hour, we want to welcome California State Assembly member Isaac Bryan, California Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, and momentarily we'll be joined by California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond. I want to say welcome to each and every one of our panelists.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah, it's always great to be with you. So thanks so very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for being here and for all you do to do the people's work. And speaking of the people's work, I would be remiss if I didn't first start off this conversation really focusing in on the health of our democracy. Last night, Dr. Weber, President Biden addressed the nation. And in addressing the nation, he sounded the alarm about election deniers running for everything from Congress to school board. Dr. Weber, can you tell our listeners, will you accept the results of the November 8th election? And how concerned are you about free and fair elections in California and nationwide?
Well, of course, I will accept the results of the election because our elections in California and even across the nation have been elections that have been transparent, have been accurate. There's been no fraud, no effort at any kind of things that have happened. And despite all of the lawsuits and the challenges over the last year since 2020, there's been no evidence at all that our elections were not correct. So, of course, a part of being in a democracy is accepting the results of the election. You win some, you lose some. It's the will of the people that has to be heard. So that becomes important. I'm greatly concerned, as we see each and every day, that there are a number of folks who are the deniers who are running for office, who would use their position in office agenda for the people. In other words, I mean is that these folks are talking about that they have laws now that they can substitute the will of the legislature for the people of California or for the people of any state that they live in. That'd be just like saying, well, there are 80 assembly members and 40 senators in California, that if they don't agree with the 22 million or 27 million voters in California, that they could take their position, their ideas, and substitute it for that. And that's what people are saying, that they want to basically have some kind of sharecropping or Jim Crow system where they are become the overseers and they can decide what the people want. And that's not what a democracy is about. And so, but that's what they want to do. If they don't like the results, even though there's no evidence at all that there's anything wrong with the results, they will deny it and they will continue to do that. That is anti the democracy that's here. And that is what is being promoted and being pushed forward. And people need to pay close attention, because while they are looking at other things, and those things may be important, like the economy and choice, those things. But the reality is the vote is a powerful tool, and it is the American equalizer. It's the one thing that we have that everybody only gets one of, no matter how important you are. You get one vote, and it really equalizes the situation in terms of people's voices. So it is dangerous when you start playing with that. We see that often. You know, Zimbabwe would have an election, and then the president didn't like the election, and they'd have another one. And then they'd have another one, and another one, until he got the result he wanted. And we look at that and we laugh, but that sounds exactly what has happened over the last 2 years since the election in 2020. People have counted and recounted and counted and recounted, and no matter how many times it comes up with the same results, we hear people saying that election was stolen, it's fraud, because they don't like the results. And when you move down that path, it is a dangerous path for democracy.
Dr. Weber, just as a follow-up to that, you have taught on the university level for many years before you went to serve in the state legislature, and now as California Secretary of State. How much of this is angry mob mentality rearing its ugly head yet again? How much of this is a response to the agency being asserted by members of our society that have historically been on the margins? How many of this is a white lash at the ballot box more than anything else?
Well, there's no question that it's all of that. I can't believe that people who are somewhat intelligent have not figured out that the 2020 election was not stolen. It didn't give them what they wanted, and they're used to getting what they want. And as a result, will do whatever they can to change the agenda, to change the language. It is no question that the numbers have changed in California and across the nation in terms of people of color. And in the past, what people had, these same people held up elections and the democracy is the best thing since sliced bread. As a kid, when poverty, despite racism that existed, people told us that this democracy was the best in the world, and that if you participate in it and so forth and so on, and they would hold it up. These are the same people now who are questioning democracy, who are questioning the right of every people to have a vote and voice. And it has to be, when you begin to look at the shift in the numbers, and you see that the people of color are increasing in numbers, this is alarming to people, because if they believe in the one person, one vote, in their mind, they may be losing, because it doesn't bode well for them in terms of their favor. So how do you do that? You rewrite the rules. And we have seen people rewrite rules before, where just as soon as you master the rules in the game, people then decide, well, we're not gonna play Monopoly anymore. Let's learn cribbage or something. Let's do something else. Let's do something that we know a little bit more about. And so this is dangerous when you start moving down that path. And this is exactly what is happening. I can't believe people don't know that these elections are transparent, that they're accurate, that there's no fraud, because they have tried every way they can to basically attack it over and over again. And they come up with the same results. And then they still say, no, it's not. And many have taken an oath that they're going to basically change what is being done without even knowing what's being done, with no evidence at all whatsoever about fraud or deception or those kinds of things. And they're working on those who who oftentimes have been on the margins and saying, okay, listen, you're on the margin because of these other people. And that is, and there's no evidence of that at all. And yet it's becoming a major challenge across the nation. And Black folks need to wake up. We need to realize where we are in this nation and what kind of battle we're into, because too many people have fought and died for us to have the right to vote, to simply allow someone else to come along and rewrite the agenda.
And speaking of folks who have done their share of fighting, I want to invite California State Assembly Member Isaac Bryan into the conversation, someone who has a track record as an organizer on a number of different social and economic justice issues in Los Angeles and across the state of California and beyond. Assemblymember Bryan, tell us, what did you make of President Biden's address yesterday? Very unusual for the leader of the party and also the president of the United States to deliver such a speech less than a week before the midterm election. Not just speaking to the issues that Democrats have been leading on and making progress on, but speaking very squarely on the challenge to our democracy, the health of our democracy. Hearing a sitting American president, talk about the dangers of potentially losing our democracy. What was your reaction to the president's remarks yesterday?
Well, first, it's really great to be with Secretary Weber and Superintendent Thurmond, two of my colleagues and mentors, and I'm honored to share this platform with you all tonight. Shout out to the KBLA family for always talking the good talk and putting the news out there as it should be heard. For me, when I heard the president's remarks, I thought about time, right? Following Donald Trump in that position is no small task. There has been a lot of misinformation, wrong political violence that's been shared across our country for a number of years now, and it's resulted in direct, visceral, visual attacks on democracy. And the more we're seeing of these tapes as the select committee hearing is happening at the congressional level, the more we're realizing just how violent what happened on January 6th was. And what we're seeing even since then is a rejection of the sound election that elected President Joe Biden, and therefore all of the policies that have resulted after. So what the president spoke about was the need for us to take all of that into account when we vote. We don't turn out for the midterm elections. We never have. And that's not just young people who I talk to the most often. All of us take those elections off. And the president is reminding us at a crucial time that now we can't just take the election off. We're taking democracy off. And if we don't speak and we're not heard, the institutions that we've spent decades and centuries building and writing and pushing towards equity and justice can be moved back just as quickly or more quickly than the gains that have been gotten. So I was glad to hear his forcefulness. I think our country needed to hear that. And I'm hoping it's going to result in a greater political engagement than we're used to seeing.
We're also joined by California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond. Welcome to our special conversation called Agenda for California, an African American Perspective. You are one of only a few statewide constitutional officers, and we're glad to have both of you here. Welcome, Superintendent Thurmond.
Thank you, Dr. Corte. Honored to join you and Dr. Weber and Assemblymember Bryan. And I just echo already the great things I've heard my colleagues say, and urging everybody, make sure you get out there and vote. This election is critical. There are people who are spreading false narratives in so many different ways, not the least of which is in our education community. And the way we overcome this lack of civility that we are seeing is to get out there and vote for the folks that you want to represent you. It's heartbreaking to see that you got people who will run into someone's house and commit violence against them. What message does that send to our children about how we solve our political disputes? And so grateful to be on the program. Thanks to everyone at KBLA. Thank you, Dr. Corte, and reminding everybody to get out and vote.
Thank you for that. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the assault on Paul Pelosi, the husband of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, in our second hour, when we talk a little bit more squarely about law enforcement issues, along with Paul Henderson, who's a former San Francisco Deputy District Attorney and currently serves as the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability Executive Director. We'll be talking more squarely about that in a little bit. But, I want to stick with you, Superintendent Thurmond, for a moment. Education is the bedrock of any healthy democratic society. And earlier today on Fox Soul's Black Report, that's my daytime show, we reported that new data showing that nearly 3 in 4 Black folks say inflation is the biggest concern facing their families, followed by abortion rights. Now, a poll done by the NAACP shows that nearly 45% of Black voters in battleground states like Georgia say that racism is their top issue, followed by criminal justice reform. In recent days, I've noticed more Democrats making the case that this election is fundamentally a contest between defenders of democracy and election deniers. In other words, with our without free and fair elections, there's no democratic society that can do any of the people's business. So do you fundamentally see this midterm election in those terms?
I do. I mean, in my own election, to be running against someone who would ban books in our state, who said that the words social justice warrior offend him. I know that everyone's talking about critical race theory, which actually isn't being taught in California. And Republicans have used that as a kind of a wedge message to win elections in states like Virginia and other places. The reality is that we are seeing there is a rise in acts of hate against many people, including African-American people. And if you look at the data that's been released by the FBI, you can see that there's been 2,800 hate crimes committed against Black folks in California in 2020. That represents about 34% of all hate crimes. So we need to talk about race and the impacts of racism that it is having and the impacts that hate is having on many communities in the Black community, and a spike in hate against the Asian American Pacific Islander community, increase in acts of anti-Semitism. This has all been unleashed by election deniers and by the chief election denier himself, President Donald Trump, who called those neo-Nazis who sadly ran people down in the streets good folks, and those folks who tried to storm our Capitol and overthrow our nation's democracy, failing to speak out about that and failing to speak out about the hostility that has been created in politics. Dr. Weber and I are always talking to students about civics. We want our students to get involved in the community. And when you see these acts of hate, it serves to stifle and intimidate those who would get involved in the community. We need to encourage our young folks so they can grow up to be assembly members like Assemblymember Ryan, who's out there talking about what social justice really means and creating opportunity to actually combat that inflation that you talked about. When you get a good job, you find a way to make yourself very viable in this community. That starts with education. We prepare you for the workforce and for you to be able to contribute in your community.
I want to go to Assemblymember Bryan for a moment. It's not lost on me thinking about the masterclass interview that KBLA's very own Tavis Smiley did just last week with LA City Council member, dare I say disgraced LA City Council member Kevin De Leon, where Tavis really called attention to this is the same person, who had called out Donald Trump, for peddling in racism and if we're just going to call it down the middle, there were some things that were said on those leaked tapes, that if you close your eyes, you would think maybe came out of, the mouth of a Donald Trump. You've been at LA City Hall a number of days since that happened. Even, your name was even mentioned in those tapes, in those recordings. Is that an example of the challenge that we are facing in our democracy, the breakdown that we're seeing in our democracy? Are we seeing that on LA's doorsteps? Is that LA City Council, leaked tape? Is that another example of our democracy in crisis? The fact that sitting LA City Council members aided by, a leader in organized labor, would sit there and plot ways to consolidate Latino political power at the expense of Black political representation. Is that not another example of an assault on our democracy?
I mean, I would say, yes, it's an example. It's not the same example, right? What we're seeing on a national level is a rejection of everything that isn't self-serving. And what we saw in Los Angeles was along that line, but a consolidation of personal power. What we've forgotten both in recent years at the national level and what we've forgotten here locally is that the job of being an elected official is to represent the people. Your responsibility is to the people. It's not to your personal power consolidation. It's not to all of the things that build you up. It's to the things that build the community up. So what we heard on those tapes was just that. It was that kind of self-serving rhetoric that turns people off from elections. In fact, I think the impact it's having in Los Angeles is one of frustration with politics as a whole. I think it's going to play out in the polls where we, had an energized electorate that became incredibly dismayed with the idea of what elected representation can and should look like, because what we saw were four of the most powerful leaders in Los Angeles not displaying the integrity that we thought that they had, but instead displaying something that was akin to political violence. And so I think they're different. I think they're related, but overall, I think the people deserve better. They deserve better than the misinformation, the hateful and the dismissive rhetoric, the rhetoric that undermines the integrity and credibility of our civic institutions at the national level. And they deserve better than elected leaders who use their positions of power and influence to build greater power and influence for themselves at the expense of the people they've been elected to represent. Overall, we deserve better, but we can't do better if we don't still stay civically engaged and get out to the ballot box. We've got a week. Folks need to get active. We've had a month to turn your ballot in. If you haven't yet, I understand mine is sitting out in that kitchen, but you got to go get it in.
That's right. We got to go get it in. Secretary Weber, you are, the head of our elections. You are entrusted to execute that role with a high degree of integrity. What say you about the LA City Council scandal? Do you think that it has tarnished not just the reputation of members of the LA City Council, but do you think that it's a demonstration of a weakening of our democracy, what you heard on those tapes?
Well, I appreciate everyone's comments on this matter. And, any time that we have individuals who engage in the kind of activity that they engaged in, it does tarnish. It tarnishes it because people lose confidence in the people who they thought they could trust. There were a lot of folks who felt betrayed that these were their friends and and that they knew these individuals and they felt very betrayed. I tried to approach it from a historical as well as a policy issue. My parents grew up in the Jim Crow South, and they lived in Jim Crow South. And so we know what Jim Crow laws are like. We know what gerrymandering is. We know what happens when people work to take away your power, which is what was taking place in that place. And whether they were Latinos or whether they were white, it is still a sick thing to do, and it's an effort to take away the power of the people in those communities, to gerrymander the districts so that some districts had more power than others, and to disempower people of color, African Americans in particular, as well as LGBT communities, and to create districts for themselves. And so it reminded me so much of what took place in the South. It reminded me of the necessity for our Voting Rights Act. And as a result, rather than sit around and talk about the individuals and how I expected more of them, we're in the process of writing legislation that will basically do what we should have done, which is to create some regulations for redistricting throughout the state, so that we take it out of the hands of individuals who, because all of us are some suspect of doing things that are in our best interest and not necessarily in the interest of the entire community. These are very powerful people, and that's why their ideas and the things they were talking about were so horrible to hear and so insidious, because they had the ability to implement them. Weren't just sitting around talking about whether they like Black people or don't like Black people, or whether it was this versus that. They have the authority to basically structure some districts that would disempower Black people. And so many Blacks felt betrayed because they thought these were folks who understood the struggle, and they didn't. They may not have even thought they were even engaging in Jim Crow activity because they didn't know what Jim Crow was. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's so important to begin to teach folks, because when I told people, I said, as I listened to that, it reminded me of the Jim Crow South. That's what they used to do. They would structure these districts so that when you voted, you were voting for nothing. You didn't have any resources in your district. You didn't have people who represented you well. There were not enough of you put together to have a power base. And that's what we worked for with regards to the Voting Rights Act and all the gerrymandering there. And I said, so while I'm running around the nation talking to Mississippi and Alabama and going to Arizona, I should have been going to Los Angeles. I mean, it's there just like everywhere else. And so for me, it's like, okay, we this happened. We have to prevent it. We have to create policies that are going to address these issues, and that and folks who are in office are suspect of basically doing things that are in their own best interest without really.
And we're going to stay on the case here. We have California State Assembly Member Isaac Bryan, California State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Thurmond, and California Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber right here with us, offering us a very important perspective. More when we come forward. You're listening to KBLA Talk 1580.
It's not a moment, it's a movement. And we're still marching. KBLA Talk 1580, unapologetically progressive.
So what you and I have got to do is get involved. In order to do this, we're starting a voters registration drive. It's going to be the ballot or the bullet. After we get our people registered, we can then organize that voting strength and channel it in the direction that will get immediate results for the benefit of our people.
Malcolm X recognized the importance of the vote as a fundamental tool of Black political power and civic engagement. Become part of the national movement to defend and help make our democracy a more perfect union. Let's use all the tools at our disposal. Register to vote and then cast your ballot on or by November 8th.
Paid for by the African American Voter Registration Education and Participation Project.
It's time to represent your neighborhood. It's time to be a voter. When you choose to be a voter, you get to decide what is best for you, your neighborhood, and your family. Use your power. Don't give it away. Have your families back and your neighborhoods back. And make a plan to vote today. Visit plan.lavote.gov. That's plan.lavote.gov to get the info you need to vote in the upcoming November election. That's plan.lavote.gov.
Now arriving, the K. Metro's newest rail line connects communities like West Adams, the Crenshaw District, Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park, Inglewood, and more. Transfer easily to the E-Line to connect to Santa Monica, Culver City, USC, and downtown. Ride the K to comfort food, culture, and an improved commute. 7 new K-Line stations now open. Learn about K-Line destinations, how to ride, and more at metro.net/K-Line. KBLA Talk 1580 is the official station of the K-Line.
Agenda for California. Welcome back to Agenda for California, an African-American perspective, presented by Smiley Audio Media Incorporated, KBLA Talk 1580, and executive produced by Tavis Smiley. Tonight's conversation features an all-star panel who we will rejoin in just a moment. The moderator this evening is Nee Quarterly Corte, co-host of Fox Soul's Black Report, chief national political analyst, and host of A More Perfect Union, Sundays on the 10s, 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. on KBLA Talk 1580. We hope you're enjoying Agenda for California, an African-American perspective, exclusively on KBLA Talk 1580. Here now, Nee Quarterly Corte.
Happy election season. Happy election season to all of our leaders, learners, and listeners. We're having a great conversation here with some of California's leading voices. These are leaders on the front lines, doing the heavy lifting. They're in the arena, and we are delighted they've made time to chat with us about some of the issues that are most important to you as you plan to cast your ballot just in time for the November 8th election. This is the agenda for California, an African-American perspective. This is part of KBLA Talk 1580 special pre-election programming. We've been having a very insightful conversation with California State Assembly member Isaac Bryan, California State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Thurmond, and California Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber. We've been talking a lot about democracy, and we touched a little bit on the LA City Council scandal and what that might mean in terms of the health of our democracy right here in the Golden State. But there are a number of other issues that we want to talk about, and we also want to give our panelists an opportunity to share their closing argument to each and every one of you as you look to cast your ballot in time for the November 8th election. And so I want to transition to talk a little bit about Twitter. Twitter is a California-based company, and Elon Musk has been in the news quite a bit. In fact, on Monday, a post falsely suggesting a personal relationship between Paul Pelosi and the alleged assailant. That post was posted by Elon Musk. It soared on Twitter a day after Musk tweeted that, and then deleted a link to that article, suggesting that there was some sort of connection that really wasn't there. We've seen that the usage of the N-word on Twitter has spiked more than 500% in the hours after Elon Musk bought the social network. My question to Assemblymember Bryan first is Black Twitter safe, or are we witnessing a slow-moving public safety risk for Twitter users and the public at large?
I think anything that Black people make popular, anything that we make profitable is not safe after we've demonstrated that. Anything that we make relevant, we're always under attack. And Twitter is one of those spaces that became and has become the information hub for all kinds of information. It was deeply disturbing to see within 48 hours of Elon Musk buying the platform for him to share an outright violent right-wing conspiracy theory on a Hillary Clinton threat. I'm not sure exactly where we go from there. We need accountability because these are the public forum. Twitter is a space, particularly during the pandemic, all social media became the only way that we could communicate openly because we couldn't see each other in the same way we had in years prior. And so we've got to get a handle on this because the violence, the anti-Blackness, the anti-Semitism, the outright hate that we're seeing on Twitter that's been promulgated by the idea that Elon Musk is going to allow it is something we've got to step up to the plate on, and he's got to step up to the plate on. Otherwise, there will be a mass exodus, and that will be unfortunate because it's a location where people receive their news the fastest. And to the greatest extent, high quality journalists like yourself, like this platform, like a number of our elected officials, people who share in truth are also on that platform. So if we can't have it be safe and protected from hate, we've got to find an alternative.
And what about students? What about students and teachers? I mean, there are a lot of folks that go to Twitter for all sorts of information, and to see such an explosion in terms of the use of the N-word on Twitter, and it seems to be a growing sort of hub for conspiracy theories and people sort of looking to weaponize information. What say you, Superintendent Thurmond? Do you think that Twitter, if it continues down this track, does it pose sort of a public health risk for Californians, particularly Black Californians and folks across the country and around the world?
Twitter could have so much power for good, and there are those who've chosen it as a vehicle to weaponize fake news and all kinds of propaganda that can be hurtful. And I just want to say right at the top, again, that I want to express my well wishes for Paul Pelosi and Speaker Pelosi and their family. The Speaker has been fighting for Californians and has been an ally to Black Californians. And again, seeing this kind of hate is a message that suggests that hate against anyone is a hate against everyone. And it remains to be seen what Twitter is going to be now that it's under new ownership. As you point out, just in a few hours of purchasing Twitter, that Elon Musk could stoke these theories that everyone knows are not true, that he could align himself with someone who is promoting hate and violence. And, Elon Musk should know better. California has done a lot for Elon Musk, and it's sad that Tesla has moved its headquarters out of California, but the California legislature and the governor and others have provided great resources to help build up Tesla and for them to leave the state, and then for Elon Musk to then allow this platform to have so many messages, where the N-word is being used. It's heartbreaking. I visited a school on Monday in Oakland, where there was a statement written in a school bathroom that said, "Black lives don't matter, kill them all." This is heartbreaking that this is what we are seeing in schools anywhere. And when the adults put out messages that propagate more hate and the use of the N-word, what is it teaching our children? And it sets us up to see more acts of hate taking place. We've been doing a thing in California that we call Education to End Hate. Dr. Weber has come on and been one of our speakers. We've talked about our ethnic studies graduation requirement that we now have in place so students can learn about the contributions of their ancestors. These are the things that we should be lifting up. We have an anti-bias education program, a $20 million grant that we are allocating to teach and train educators to address bias in our classrooms. These are the things that we should be lifting up. And Twitter can be a powerful message for good. It remains to be seen if Elon Musk is going to stand up and let that be a platform for truth, for transparency, and for good. Or is he going to just do what others are doing, stoking fear, stoking violence? We call on Elon Musk and others to stop promoting propaganda and hate and to let that be a platform for communication and for learning and for helping to get the word out in our state about important events and information.
Secretary Weber, we just heard Superintendent Thurmond really lay out the clear and present danger that Twitter poses to the public. You are Secretary of State of one of the largest states in our union. There are 40 million people in California and tens of millions of people that vote in California every election. Can you share with us as clearly as you can, how does the safety challenges, the risks, the conspiracy theories, the propaganda, the misinformation, disinformation that we see growing in volume every single day, not just on Twitter, but on other social media platforms. Can you give our viewers and listeners a sense of how does that make your job more difficult? What material difference does that make in terms of the kind of Secretary of State you are and the kind of Secretary of State you could be if you weren't so bogged down with having to address some of the propaganda, quite frankly, that spreads like wildfire through misinformation machines like Twitter at its functioning at its worst?
Well, I think you've kind of laid out one of the greatest challenges that we face right now in not only the Secretary of State's office, but throughout the operation of the state of California and all the states that are there. People are so willing to accept misinformation. They're also so unwilling to seek knowledge themselves. And so they take the shortcut, and the shortcut is your Twitter. It is your technology that's there that conclusions that are made without any kind of data and information and background and so forth and so on. I saw it coming when I was a professor at the university when students wanted to turn in papers. There were nothing but Twitter statements and with no research, no background. And of course they got Fs and had to go do it again. But the reality is that people are looking for shortcuts. We also are in a situation where we somehow or another believe that people who have money have morals. I don't know why we believe that. You know, we think our athletes are brilliant, so we think that they have something to say about politics, and some do, and many of them don't. We look for those individuals to kind of be our mentors rather than looking at the character of the individual, seeing what they've done. And so the jury is out on Elon Musk because I'm trying to figure out what he's done other than be a brilliant person who's been the leader in terms of the electric cars and so forth and so on, and has been able to navigate that. But does that make him a moral individual? Does that make him the carrier of our ideas? He comes out of South Africa, and I've been there many times. And so there's some issues, obviously, that have come out of that. And so I tell people, I said, you know, we need to pay attention to who we think we put our trust in, our faith in, because we make these sweeping assumptions, and then we turn around and be so disappointed, as if we had some reason to not be disappointed. The man invented a car, you know, and he didn't create morality. He hasn't done anything directly for African Americans to make us stand up and say, wow, you know, you changed on us. So I'm saying to people, stop looking at folks who we don't know anything about to lead us. That's number one. Number two, being Black is hard. It requires some work. And most of us don't want to work to figure out who our heroes and sheroes are and who we need to be fighting for and the issues that we face each and every day. We have to make sure our kids are educated, you know, and that is going to be a hard job for us. We can't keep turning them over to people who've never basically had an interest in our children to educate our kids without monitoring and some level of supervision. So I'm saying to folks, you know, when I look at our ancestors and what they did and how they fought so hard and how they did everything they could to give us the stuff we needed, we can't think that this stuff is going to come as instant oatmeal in 2 minutes. You know, it is going to take some old stirring and some old activity to get things done. It is a tremendous challenge in this state right now because of all the lies that people tell. You know, I constantly go on these programs and somebody says there are 1.5 million, 1.8 or whatever it is, illegal people registered in California to vote. I said, or they shouldn't be voting because they shouldn't, and, you know, 1.8 million. I said, okay, that sounds, I said, everybody tells me that, I always tell them, well, at least give me one name and an address. Okay, let me work on that one first, and then I'll get to the others. Most of the time, they don't have the name and the address. They just have some numbers that they've made up to excite people. We need to basically start taking control of it like you are on this program. The information that we give our folks need to come from trusted messengers. We're going to have to get out there and teach our people over and over again about who they are, where they are, and how hard this battle is. And stop expecting other people to basically be our voice when they have never been our voice before. So I've never been a Twitter person. I know a lot of people lean on it and what have you. And I'm saying, people, you know, you need to pay attention to everything, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, whatever information you get, ask questions about it. Why? Because we have been in this country for 400 years and we still find ourselves battling for a place at the table. We're still battling to get some dignity. And when we have shown nothing but grace and dignity, we weren't the ones scaling a wall on January 6th. We never have been. But if you close your eyes and turn everybody that was scaling the wall into Black, you know what would happen for January 6th, okay? So let's be real about being in California and where we are and what we need to do. We can't sugarcoat this stuff. It's real. And I can tell you that it is the information that comes across my desk, the material that I've seen from the so-called America First, the stuff that they're mailing out, the commercials in Georgia are blaming Black people for every problem that has ever existed in this nation. And they say it openly, you know, and so this stuff is so blatant. It's worse than during the Jim Crow era. People tried to pretend they liked you then, but this stuff is so blatant that comes across my mail. It comes across the various social media in terms of what all the stuff is out there. There is a war against us. And the worst thing I tell people all the time is the worst thing in the world is to be at war and think you're at peace. Because when you are, you get wiped out. We better be prepared. We better understand that we have to be engaged. We must vote. We have no alternative. We don't have the luxury of sitting around and believing that someone is going to take care of us. We're going to have to vote for ourselves, our children, our families, and we're going to have to get everybody we can to take it seriously, because this is an outright onslaught attack against Black people in this nation.
Well, you laid it out. You laid it out. You made it plain, Dr. Weber. Thank you for that. That is the whole intention of this program, is to make it plain so that our viewers and listeners can be as informed as possible as they cast their ballot on election day, or if they're like so many of us that vote by mail, while they can be listening to this while they're filling out their ballot. Right. And so thank you for that information. I want to go back to Superintendent Thurmond, and because education is sort of a through line in everything we've been discussing. The health of education is an indicator of the health of our democracy. Education is an indicator in terms of the health of our public discourse, et cetera. According to the LA Times, 2 out of 3 California students did not meet math standards, and more than half did not meet English standards on state assessments in the spring. And even more devastating, 84% of Black students and 79% of Latino and low-income students, they didn't meet math standards. So aside from the effects of the pandemic, I think we would all concede that the pandemics were a setback in terms of public education of all students, while some students, felt the impact more greatly. How did things get so bad? And why should Black voters put our faith in you to make a material difference if we give you another term?
Well, the truth of the matter is everything does start with education, and we have to create a better opportunity for California children. And if you look at the statistics that you just read, they're in comparison to how students were doing in 2019, even before the pandemic, meaning we have seen these historic gaps for African-American children, Latino children, kids of color, even before the pandemic, and they have gotten worse in many categories since the pandemic. We've got a lot of work to do. It's heartbreaking to know that when the pandemic started, on top of everything else that our kids were seeing, loved ones who they lost to the pandemic, they watched, like we did, the killing of George Floyd on television before our very eyes. Our kids moved into distance learning, where 1 million kids did not have a computer in California or access to high-speed internet. That makes no sense to me in the 4th wealthiest economy in the world, that could be. Within weeks, we had to spring into action, and thanks to the good work of then Assemblymember Weber and Assemblymember Bryan, we were able to generate revenue to get kids 1 million computers and $6 billion to have broadband in our state. We are closing the digital divide once and for all. We're following that up with universal meals for our hungry kids. We gave out 800 million meals during the pandemic to hungry families. And so now we're providing preschool for every 4-year-old. And just a few days ago, we started to allocate money for what we call our reading coaches and specialist grants. Let's teach our children to read. For decades, folks have talked about making sure that students learn to read by 3rd grade so they graduate and not drop out and end up in the criminal justice system. I've made a pledge. We're going to make sure that every student who's entered school this year in kindergarten can read by 3rd grade, and we're backing it up with resources to make that happen for tutoring and training for our kids. Our kids can achieve, but they often face barriers that get in their way. We're about making our business removing those barriers so our kids can learn and recognizing that they experience trauma. We've just secured the funding to recruit 10,000 counselors to work in our schools. There's no other way to put it. In order for our students to move forward, we have to recruit more teachers and educators and counselors and diversify our workforce. And we're going about the business of doing that. We are, as we speak, offering $20,000 scholarships to anyone who wants to be a teacher and a $20,000 scholarship to anyone who wants to be a counselor in our schools. And we hope that those who are following the program this evening will take up those opportunities to become part of our educator workforce so that we can change the narrative of what Black students have had to deal with over the last several years and what all students are dealing with. We can make a better way, and we will. As difficult as the pandemic has been, this is an inflection point for us to build a better education system than what we had before. And if we're being honest, what we had before was not addressing the needs of Black students and Latino students and low-income students. We have an opportunity to build something better. And I'm excited about the possibility, should the voters reelect me, that the next 4 years we'll be building that with the universal preschool and the universal meals and reading programs to support all of our students. And we will help our students heal, we will help them recover, and we will help them thrive as they move towards the jobs of tomorrow.
In our remaining moments, I want to give each of our panelists about a minute to share with us their closing argument. My question to them: what is your closing argument to Black voters in the Golden State, Black voters in California and across the country, as it feels like we're on the brink of either a really great breakthrough or a major setback, or maybe a little bit of both, if we don't exercise our agency at the ballot box? And so, Assembly Member Bryan, I'm going to go to you first in about a minute. Can you share with us, what is your closing argument?
Well, we put Black folks in positions to lead when we're in the greatest crisis, right? The greatest recession since the Great Depression is when we elected our first Black president. A physical assault on democracy is when we had our first Black Secretary of State, and Dr. Weber. A global pandemic that crippled our education infrastructure across the world is when we had somebody like Superintendent Thurmond in this position. And now we've got to give our leaders time to lead. We can't scapegoat this issue when it's so much bigger than this current moment. We've got to invest the resources. We've got to put the right people in positions of influence. We've shown progress when the right people are where they belong. So turn up for the polls, because if we don't, we're going to take these moments and they're going to impact our communities first and worst, as they always have. So step up, support your leaders, put them back in office, get the terrible ones out and replace them with the next generation. We've got work to do, and we can't do that work if people stay at home and don't fill out their ballots. So get out and vote. It's time.
Thank you. Dr. Weber, our California Secretary of State, in a minute, can you share with us your closing argument to California Black voters and voters that are listening and streaming this across the country?
I want to say to all of the Black voters out there and everyone who really cares that this is your moment. We have sometimes thought about the fact that my students used to always tell me that if they were alive during the civil rights movement, they would kick butt, take names, they would do everything under the world. They wouldn't tolerate this, they wouldn't tolerate that. That sounds good, but I'm telling them now, this is your moment. This is what you've been practicing for, because we are in a crisis unlike any crisis we've faced before. And yet the good thing is that we have had ancestors who faced this crisis for us in the past, who've given us a foundation upon which we can grow and develop. And so voting is one of the two things that Black people fought for. One was education, because as our parents always told you, when you get an education, they can't take it from you. No matter what they do to you, they got to call you Dr. Weber no matter what, because they can't take it from you. You earned it, it is yours. But also they taught us that if you don't vote, everything that you work for can be taken away by the laws that have been created. So our folks had two things that they fought hard for. One was education and the other was the right to vote. Both of those are in peril right now. And we owe it to our ancestors, we owe it to our parents and our grandparents to make a difference and truly, truly exercise that right that so many of them were denied in the 50s and the 40s. So this is your moment. Let's make it count. Let's make sure people know that Black people care and that we are going to live up to the legacy that our ancestors gave us. And that is the right to vote and the right to have a strong and powerful education.
Thank you for that. In about a minute, same to you, Superintendent Thurmond. In about a minute, what's your closing argument to California Black voters and Black voters everywhere?
Think about your grandparents and your ancestors, many of whom who died to give us the right to vote. Think about the disproportionality that we see right now for African Americans as it relates to healthcare, environmental injustice, the criminal justice system, economic disparities. There is a solution that we have available to us to do something about it. And that is to elect leaders who are about this work and about changing that disproportionality and creating opportunity for all. So get out there and vote. Whoever you vote for, just get out there and take advantage of the vote. If you like to be in the poll, then November 8th is for you. But early voting is a powerful tool as well. Grab that ballot and get it in the mailbox. You don't even have to put a stamp on it, but you'll be putting a stamp on the kinds of changes that we need to see for African Americans and all people in the great state of California.
My thanks to a very distinguished panel. I mean, they represent some of the best and brightest elected officials we have in California, some of the best and brightest leaders that we have in this nation. My thanks to California State Assembly Member Isaac Bryan, to California State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Thurmond, and to California Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber, really laying it out for us, making it very plain, making it clear that there's so many things that are at stake for our communities. Dr. Weber sharing, really reminding us what we owe to our ancestors, what we owe to the folks that came before us, who fought so hard, so valiantly, particularly for education and voting rights. Superintendent Thurmond reminding us that there are forces out there that think of social justice warriors, think of that as sort of a bad word, a bad combination of words, and making the case that the contrast between what these leaders are offering, what others are offering is a vastly different vision of what progress may look like for each and every one of us in our communities. Our thanks to each and every one of you for joining us. I'm Dr. Nicordelai Corte. You're listening to KBLA Talk 1580. More when we come forward. You don't want to miss our second hour with the LA County Board of Supervisors Chair, Holly Mitchell, with the Executive Director of the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability, Paul Henderson, and public opinion researcher of Evictus, Sha'Carri Byerly. You don't want to miss it. When we come forward, you're listening to a special edition of our KBLA Talk 1580 pre-election programming, Agenda for California, an African-American perspective.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
Let us march on. The men and women will no longer walk the streets.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you. Good luck to you in your races.
March on. Until brotherhood is more than a meaningless word at the end of a prayer, but the first order of business on every legislative agenda. Let us march on ballot boxes until every valley shall be exalted, until every mountain and hill shall be made low, until the rough places are made plain and the crooked places straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. Let us march on ballot boxes until we are able to send to the state houses men who will do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with their God.
Paid for by the African American Voter Registration, Education, and Participation Project.
It's time to represent your neighborhood. It's time to be a voter. When you choose to be a voter, you get to decide what is best for you, your neighborhood, and your family. Use your power. Don't give it away. Have your families back and your neighborhoods back. And make a plan to vote today. Visit plan.lavote.gov. That's plan.lavote.gov to get the info you need to vote in the upcoming November election. That's plan.lavote.gov.
Now arriving, the K. Metro's newest rail line connects communities like West Adams, the Crenshaw District, Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park, Inglewood, and more. Transfer easily to the E-Line to connect to Santa Monica, Culver City, USC, and downtown. Ride the K to comfort food, culture, and an improved commute. 7 new K-Line stations now open. Learn about K-Line destinations, how to ride, and more at metro.net/K-Line. KBLA Talk 1580 is the official station of the K-Line.
Agenda for California. Welcome Welcome back to Agenda for California, an African American perspective, presented by Smiley Audio Media Incorporated, KBLA Talk 1580, and executive produced by Tavis Smiley. Tonight's conversation features an all-star panel who you will meet in just a moment. The moderator this evening is Nee Quarterly Corte, co-host of Fox Soul's Black Report, chief national political analyst, and host of A More Perfect Union, Sundays on the 10s, 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. on KBLA Talk 1580. We hope you're enjoying Agenda for California, an African American perspective, exclusively on KBLA Talk 1580. Here now, Nee Quarterly Corte.
Hello. Happy almost election day. So delighted to spend this time with each and every one of you. I'm beaming in today from Detroit, Michigan. But this conversation is squarely about an agenda for California, an African-American perspective. I'm Dr. Nee Quarterly Corte, moderator of A More Perfect Union and chief national political analyst for KBLA Talk 1580. Happy election season to all of our leaders, learners, and listeners. I want to remind you all that even though Election Day is November 8th, early voting and vote by mail is available here in California and in many states across the country. Now, you can go to iwillvote.com. Go to iwillvote.com to get the information that you and your family need to make your voices heard this midterm election. Now, if you or your family members are more concerned about pocketbook issues or about access to affordable health care, police reform and public safety, access to financial capital, ending the movement to ban Black history from our school curriculum, or just tired of efforts to erase the contributions of our fellow LGBTQ Americans, don't sit this election out. Don't you do it. Democracy is on the ballot, and like a mighty stream, so many issues that are important to us, that's important to our communities, are an outgrowth of the health of our democracy and the power of our vote. I want to encourage each of you to, stay in touch with me. You can follow me at Dr. Nee Quarterly. It's DrNiiQuartelai, Dr. Nee Quarterly on Twitter and Instagram. Always make sure you download the KBLA app to listen to us live or on demand, or you can even tell Alexa to play KBLA Talk 1580. And subscribe to A More Perfect Union podcast. That way, every Sunday, we get to continue the conversation here. Or for your viewing pleasure, you can tune in to Fox Soul's Black Report 5 days a week at 6 p.m. Eastern and 3 p.m. Pacific, or just download the Fox Soul app to get some information and some news you can use 5 days a week as we take you on a journey across Black America. But while we're talking about Black America, we've got to talk about Black California. And I'm sure so many of you have heard this before, as goes California, as goes the nation. But first, we must decide who represents us and prioritize the issues that matter most to our community. Now, Black folks are not a monolith. I'm sure you know that through the programming that we offer each and every day on KBLA Talk 1580. Our programming is not a monolith, and neither are Black folks. Tonight's panelists are a reflection of that. Tonight's panelists understand that our community is not a monolith, and they govern themselves, and they govern their work accordingly. In our first hour, you heard from California State Assembly member Isaac Bryan, California State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Thurmond, and California Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber. We heard from them earlier, and this hour, we get to hear from two of California's really distinguished leaders on the state that have experience on the state level and also have experience on the local level. I'm talking about the chair of our LA County Board of Supervisors, Holly J. Mitchell, and Executive Director of the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability, Paul Henderson. I want to welcome the two of you to our very special program today, Agenda for California, an African American Perspective. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
It's great to be with you. And Paul Henderson, you're on mute, but I can read lips too.
I got excited and I did not push mute. But now I'm excited again.
No worries, no worries. Welcome. Paul, I want to start with you, and I want to start with you because of your proximity to a terrible assault on our democracy. Last night, I'm sure you heard President Biden deliver remarks to the nation less than a week before our midterm election. I can't remember the last time I've heard a sitting president of the United States get out there, and he's not talking about, some of the issues that folks have polled on all election cycle, but he was speaking squarely about our democracy and really sort of sounding the alarm at the great risk that we're in terms of the health of our democracy, the risk that we're running in terms of political violence in this country, voter intimidation in this country. Just a few days ago, we saw a headline that we never thought we would see. We saw the assault, the husband of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, was assaulted in their home with a hammer and by an assailant that was politically motivated. Can you share with us how are the people of San Francisco doing, first of all?
I think
the people of San Francisco, who have certainly been no stranger to political violence. When we think about Mayor Moscone, when we think about Harvey Milk, when we think about a number of folks, that region of the country has not been immune to political violence. How are the people of San Francisco processing what happened? And what can Black folks across this state and across this country learn from this terrible assault on the husband of the second in line to the presidency?
Yeah, I think political violence as a subject matter, obviously it's at the forefront, but right now in San Francisco, that's a real concern, as is any kind of violence. But the problem with political violence is we've seen a proliferation and a foundation that's been laid in recent news and in recent headlines with political activism across the board in the nation. The fact that it's happening here in San Francisco, where many would consider to be a liberal, if not progressive area, is a drastic concern, is that people are being attacked and targeted for political activism, regardless of what side you're on. That's a real problem. But for San Francisco in particular, and for the Pelosi family in particular, for the folks that are being addressed, and again, I want to bring this back to addressing race intentionally. These are many of the leaders that are focused on defending racial rights. These are many of the folks that care about issues that disproportionately affect communities of color. And when and as we see violence directed towards those leaders, it magnifies the problems. We have so few voices that are fighting for us in this way that it really heightens the importance of what's significance. And it's not lost on me, and I think this was part of your lead into the conversation, that this is tied to some of the issues that we're seeing, as well as having political violence exacerbated in this nation. We're also seeing an exacerbation of voter suppression, all of the things that you were just earlier talking about, the strict photo IDs, the restriction and elimination of Sunday voting, the vote by mail, early voting, closed poll locations, all of that ties into the problems that we have in trying to assert our own rights and to have visibility, and even to support leaders when they're going to be and could be attacked like this. It's a much more complicated issue than I think people have given contemplation to, because as we talk about trying to balance public safety versus public access, we really have to try and figure out what those boundaries are going to be in terms of how we're going to protect elected leaders and or their family and or their staff and or their residences, either in the location where they're elected, like here in California, when they're working in Washington, D.C. or someplace else. And that's not an uncommon thing, but these are all the things that are triggered when we have an attack like this and we're left to process this as a community. It's just not lost on me the disproportionate effect that this has against communities of color.
Now I want to bring in the chair of the LA County Board of Supervisors, Holly J. Mitchell. And Supervisor Mitchell, I want to invite you to share how you're processing a couple of things, how you're processing that really memorable speech that President Biden delivered to the nation just yesterday, really sounding the alarms on the fragility of our democracy. I also want to ask how you're processing recent events involving not just the political violence against the husband of Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, but even in Los Angeles. We read in the papers not long ago that there was a break-in at the home of Congresswoman Karen Bass, where there were 2 stored firearms that were stolen from her home, and luckily nothing has become of those stolen firearms. But how are you processing what feels like an uptick in divisive rhetoric, in political violence, in intimidation? As the chair of the largest county Board of Supervisors in the country, a very high-profile individual yourself, how are you processing these recent events?
Well, Dr. Corte, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us all to have this really important, timely conversation. And, one thing I'll have to say on a very personal level, what I am trying not to do is to internalize it. I was first elected to office in 2010, and the threat to my personal safety, the social media references to what one would do to my children and family members based on policies I brought forth on behalf of the nation's most populous state began from the very beginning, quite frankly. And so it's something that I've had to contend with as a single mother, raising a young Black man who came into his formative years during the time that I've been in public office, the conversations I've been forced to have with him based on my fears that because of the public policy stance I was taking on behalf of the residents I represented, that he would be targeted. So, what I've always tried to do in living in that reality is to not really internalize it, given the average life expectancy of a Black woman. I want to be mindful of how I manage that kind of stress. But, I appreciate the president's words. And my concern is we have become such a polarized society. I hope the president wasn't merely speaking to the choir. The overall lack of civility and humanity in our public discourse is discouraging, deeply discouraging. We have a program here at LA County, LA versus Hate, because of the significant increase in hate crimes, targeting my Asian American family, friends, and neighbors, my Jewish family, friends, and neighbors, my African American family, friends, and neighbors, my LGBTQ family, friends, and neighbors. This whole notion of otherism, if you don't look like me, if you are not me, if you think differently than me, then not only are you wrong, I have a right to cause you physical harm. Not only is Mr. Pelosi's attack
so deeply sobering. But to hear what the assailant intended to do to our speaker if she had been there, that if he determined that she was going to tell a lie, that he was going to be judge and jury. And as he is quoted in the press as saying, he intended to break her kneecaps. We are in I think, real crossroads, as the president suggested, not only in terms of our democracy as a nation, but in terms of our sheer civility and humanity.
Supervisor Holly J. Mitchell making it plain there, really underscoring how much this notion of otherism has taken root and has spread almost like a wildfire across our country. How feels that more folks are taking the law into their own hand, and I would add taking lawlessness into their own hands, choosing to be judge, jury, and if given the opportunity, executioner. This is feels like a very dark moment for our democracy. It really feels like our democracy is teetering. I was just sharing with a colleague here at the station the other day that this time next week, we really don't have an idea of what the state of our nation will be. Paul, do you feel similarly? Do you feel as if nobody ever knows how elections are going to work out, right? But now it almost feels like we're having to consider the possibility of, well, what happens if there's not just mass protests, but what if there's mass violence? What if this? What if that? Do you find yourself playing the what if game, especially given the climate in places like San Francisco today?
I think it's more than a what if, because we're starting to see those actual acts of violence taking place. I mean, I've worked in the public sector for a very long time. I've worked with Holly Mitchell for a very long time, dealing with issues related to policy. And I will say, certainly over my career, I've been threatened. I've seen other elected officials threatened. What to me stands out is that the issues that most often I'm reminded of in those instances is that they are areas addressing both progress and reform, specifically in areas that are targeted to address race disparities in our society. And to me, the fact that that is the trigger for a lot of these evolved, or actually the opposite of evolved, but that's the trigger for this violence is what's of real concern to me. We have acts like the mass riot from January 6th, and we have these instances where it's beyond just the threat of violence, but actual violence. To me, it's not lost on me that it is so closely associated, if not just by in time, to upcoming midterm elections that are going to be crucial, if not outcome determinative, for communities of color and the rest of this nation. There is so much at stake all across the board in terms of even how this nation approaches its own problems and its own challenges. Even before we start addressing race intentionally, I can't disassociate the rise in violence. I can't disassociate the rhetoric that has been amplified in this nation over the past few years in association with what is at stake with our democracy. They're so closely tied, and I can't separate the two as we roll into these upcoming midterm elections that I think are going to be so crucially important. And I believe that the violence associated with these upcoming elections is intentional and purposeful. I think it's designed to tell leaders that have raised issues that people don't agree with to step back, and if not, that they will face violence. And I think that message is being sent to communities as well, specifically communities of color. And I will say and argue that that is disenfranchised communities in total that are being threatened with the violence. I think it feels clear to me seems obvious to me and dangerous to me.
Yeah, that point is very well taken. I mean, right after, I got the news alert about the assault on Mr. Pelosi, right away I thought, well, if Mr. Pelosi is not safe in his own house, then what about some of the spouses of some of the highest profile, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, for example? I won't name names, but, well, I will name names. I was thinking about Congressman Benny Thompson, who's chair of the January 6th committee. I immediately thought of his safety. I thought of the safety of Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who's been very outspoken for a long time on a whole range of issues. I thought about folks like Congressman Greg Meeks, who chairs House Foreign Affairs Committee, and so many other high-profile Black elected officials that I know. I thought about their safety because, again, if Mr. Pelosi is not safe in his own house, and that's the husband of the Speaker of the House, then, what about other people? I mean, the New York Times, reported that Representative Cori Bush of St. Louis had spent upwards of, $400,000, on security. They had reported that Senator Raphael Warnock, who's running for re-election in Georgia, has spent somewhere around $900,000 in additional security since he was sworn in 2021. These are no headlines that any public official wants to have. But I've got to ask you, Supervisor Mitchell, do you expect things to get worse before they get better?
That is a very interesting question, and I think it's up to all of us. That's an interesting question, and I don't know that I have an answer. And I think I don't have an answer because I have to be, given the work that I do, optimistic. I have to get up every day knowing that 10 million Angelenos are counting on me to deliver critical life-sustaining services in a thoughtful, equitable way. And so I have to believe that we have the power to make it better. I had the privilege a number of years ago of being a part of a women's leadership program hosted by Governing Magazine, where they convene these women leaders, some governors, lieutenant governors, state legislators, and that's the position I held at the time, from across the country. We would come together 4 times a year for a true leadership training exercise and experience for ourselves. Brought in amazing speakers. And we heard from and talked to an economic futurist who talked about this concept really of seasons and how, after winter comes spring. And she plotted the political and economic winters, if you will, since the beginning of our nation's founding. That after, a deep winter, we came into a spring after the Great Depression, and after that experience is when we experienced, Social Security as we know it today, Medicare as we know it today, the minimum wage as we know it today. And so I'm choosing to think of the season we are in currently as winter, knowing that we will evolve from it into a spring that will reflect policies and practices that are going to reflect this period that we're currently in. It's going to take all of us to make the intention of getting there. It's going to take all of us to ask critical questions of those who seek our vote. It's going to require that all of us, check our own biases, check our own fears, think about our sources of information and be curious and ask the why. This notion that false narratives and blatant wrong information can permeate our airwaves, and that we will be kind of lulled into complacency based on hearing supposed facts that, justify our existing opinions is a problem. we've got to be curious and encourage people to push through those things to get out on the other side of this otherism tendency.
Just as a follow-up, Supervisor Mitchell, in about a minute, I've got to ask you this question. You talk about sources of information, and in the first hour, we talked about Twitter. As you know, Twitter is now, now under the ownership of Elon Musk. We know that since he has become the new owner of Twitter, we know that the use of the N-word has spiked 500%. We also know that there's been some evidence that not only he, but other folks have been growing in the number of conspiracy theories that have been, peddled through Twitter. Folks flocking to Twitter, as a place to disseminate information, and dare I say misinformation, disinformation. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what you think about that sale and in terms of the public health risk that may create. I know as chair of the LA County Board of Supervisors, when you talk about the vital services that people expect you to deliver on, one of those services is making sure that our public health department is world class. And I'm curious from your perspective whether or not some of the recent trends, whether we're talking about Twitter or some of the other social media platforms and the alleged public health risk that they present. I'm curious as to how that is making life harder. I don't think it's easier, but harder for you. I want to give you a chance to think about that a little bit while we take a little bit of a moment to get some more information. I am so delighted to be in conversation this evening with the chair of the LA County Board of Supervisors, Holly J. Mitchell. I'm also delighted to be in conversation with Paul Henderson, the executive director of the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability. We're going to talk to them about Twitter. We're going to talk to them about law enforcement. We're going to talk about some ballot measures that you all should be paying extra close attention to, and more. You're listening to KBLA Talk 1580. More when we come forward.
It's not a moment. It's a movement. And we're still marching. KBLA Talk 1580. Unapologetically progressive.
If Black Lives Matter, make black votes count. Vote by November 8th. Long lines. Voter roll purges. Voter identification laws. Voter intimidation. Felony disenfranchisement. Polling place closures. Early voting limitations. Partisan redistricting. Partisan Supreme Court rulings. Invalidation of the Voting Rights Act. Vote on or by November 8th. If Black Lives Matter, make black votes count. Tamir Rice, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Heather Heyer, Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Fred Hampton, Werner, Goodman, and Cheney, Viola Louisu, Fannie Lou Hamer, John Lewis. They rest in power. Make their memory in power when you vote on or by November 8th. If you believe Black Lives Matter, then make black votes count.
Paid for by the African American Voter Registration, Education, and Participation Project.
It's time to represent your neighborhood. It's time to be a voter. When you choose to be a voter, you get to decide what is best for you, your neighborhood, and your family. Use your power. Don't give it away. Have your families back and your neighborhoods back. And make a plan to vote today. Visit plan.lavote.gov. That's plan.lavote.gov to get the info you need to vote in the upcoming November election. That's plan.lavote.gov.
Now arriving, the K. Metro's newest rail line connects communities like West Adams, the Crenshaw District, Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park, Inglewood, and more. Transfer easily to the E-Line to connect to Santa Monica, Culver City, USC, and downtown. Ride the K to comfort food, culture, and an improved commute. 7 new K-Line stations now open. Learn about K-Line destinations, how to ride, and more at metro.net/K-Line. KBLA Talk 1580 is the official station of the K-Line.
back to Agenda for California, an African American perspective, presented by Smiley Audio Media Incorporated, KBLA Talk 1580, and executive produced by Tavis Smiley. Tonight's conversation features an all-star panel who we will rejoin in just a moment. The moderator this evening is Nee Quarterly-Corte, co-host of Fox Soul's Black Report, chief national political analyst, and host of A More Perfect Union, Sundays on the 10s, 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. on KBLA Talk 1580. We hope you're enjoying Agenda for California, an African American perspective, exclusively on KBLA Talk 1580. Here now, Nee Quarterly-Corte.
We are so delighted to welcome you back to Agenda for California, an African American perspective. I couldn't be more thrilled as we're less than a week out from one of the most important midterm elections in our nation's history. I couldn't be more thrilled than to be in conversation with two of some of my brightest fellow Californians. The chair of the LA County Board of Supervisors, Holly J. Mitchell, and executive director of the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability, my friend Paul Henderson. So delighted to have you all here. Before we took a moment to get some more information for our listeners who are filling out their vote by mail ballots as we speak. We're seeing a record early voter turnout in various parts of the country. And so that is encouraging. But before we took a pause, I asked Supervisor Mitchell her thoughts on the public health risk. Does she see any public health risk that Twitter is posing to the public at large, but particularly Black Twitter? We saw the use of the N-word spike 500%. This man has not owned Twitter, more than a week. We're seeing those kinds of trends that are deeply disturbing. And so I want to invite Supervisor Holly J. Mitchell to share what she makes of that as somebody who presides over one of the largest public health departments in the country.
I appreciate you, Dr. Corte. And let me say, I saw you give me a shout out for the Crown Act the other day on your new show. So I appreciate the shout out. Thank you very much. As I thought about the question.
Shout outs are good, but having even better.
I'll be there. I'd love to. As I thought about your question, two things came to mind, quite frankly. This is not the first time that a white man of means and entitlement has attempted to control the media. You go back to the early days of the newspaper industry, and names like Hearst and others. So this isn't the first time that people of immeasurable wealth have, found their way into attempting to control messaging. That's number one. Number two, Black people are huge social media consumers. So if we were to exit stage left, all such platforms, that would send a resounding message to those who attempt to own these platforms, because it would hit their bottom line. So we need to think back to our rich civil rights history and the history of bus boycotts and lunch counter takeovers, and recognize the power we have in our sheer number as consumers. And if social media is going to be manipulated in a way that brings us harm, then we need to lock arms and speak up and out. Now, I, along with everybody else, enjoy a little TikTok video and a little Instagram and a little Twitter this, Twitter that, as my elder family members say. But as you said, I appreciate you framing it in the context of a public health challenge. And again, misinformation probably led to the deaths of significant numbers of people during the public health crisis we recently faced. People be lured by misinformation and not following the real science and protecting themselves and their loved ones from this virus. So you're right, it is a public health hazard. It is the death by 1,000 cuts that we as Black people experience with bias, implicit and otherwise. It is the taunting use of the N-word in social media and other places that does have a direct impact on our health. In response to your first question tonight, you asked how I was responding to the violence, and I said, the first thing I was trying not to do was to internalize it for just that reason. So I think that we have to have the conversation about what we're willing to, quote, give up, if you will, in terms of our own social media consumption to send a clear message about what's acceptable from our perspective and what's not.
I think you're right. I think you're really onto a whole lot, Supervisor Mitchell. While we are correcting misinformation, I want to ask you about a very important ballot measure that you've been very public about in terms of your support. It's an important ballot measure. I'm curious for Black voters that are just beginning to pay attention to the major issues before them this election. Can you explain Measure A, why you support it, and why anyone looking to hold leadership in law enforcement should strongly consider it? And more importantly, in what ways would a measure like this lead the nation?
I appreciate you affording me the opportunity. Today's LA Times documents a statement I made in the Board of Supervisors meeting just this week, Tuesday, where we were voting to agree to pay over $50 million in lawsuit settlements against the Sheriff's Department. That was just one board meeting. And when I began to try to look at other municipalities of similar size, LA County is 10 million residents, New York is 9 million, to figure out if, while viscerally I knew that number was just astonishing, I really wanted to get a sense of, where we were on the spectrum. And in one board meeting, we passed several motions to award $50 million in settlement dollars. New York, in the entirety of 2021, spent $95 million. And so when we look at the culture in the Sheriff's Department, when we look at, quite frankly, tragically, decades of excessive use of force and abuse, the Tuesday example in those 5 or 6 lawsuits is just a mere example of what Angelenos have experienced across the board. And so when we look at having an elected sheriff in LA County, who is currently under investigation from the top cop in the state, the Attorney General, the state of California, the Federal Department of Justice, I have to say to myself, how do we make sure that the residents of LA County are represented by a sheriff who, him or herself, doesn't violate the law? So if the voters pass Measure A for accountability, it would allow an elected sheriff who violates the law or abuses power to be removed from office with a 4/5 vote of the Board of Supervisors. Under our current system, where there is no really accountability between election cycles, voters would have to wait for a grand jury to convene, a quo warranto action or a recall election to be held. Our Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission and the community have repeatedly asked our board to explore stronger options for meaningful accountability. And the voters, I believe, deserve a chance to decide whether this is the right way to enhance accountability for their sheriff or not. So they will have the opportunity next Tuesday, November 8th, to make that decision in whether or not they choose to vote yay or nay for Measure A.
Well, if we were playing a drinking game and accountability was the word, I think we would have a little bit of a buzz right about now. Measure A for accountability. And I want to now turn to Paul Henderson. I've mentioned before that you're executive director of the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability. One of the recurring trends that we have seen this election cycle, a number of issues that voters, particularly Black voters, are concerned about, pocketbook issues that they're concerned about, inflation, the effects of inflation, gas prices, all of those issues, but still policing, public safety, police reform also remains a persistent challenge in Black communities across California and across the nation. You have a very interesting job. There are not many folks that serve in a role where they are able to, day after day after day, develop systems and processes and standards and practices and policies that work with law enforcement and other stakeholders to create greater accountability, greater transparency. I don't in any way mean to suggest that your job is done. You have a very daunting task, particularly in times like this. But can you share with us, your progress report in terms of the work that is underway in the city and county of San Francisco? And to what extent can cities and counties across California and across the nation, really glean insights that may be instructive to how they vote this coming November 8th?
Yeah, well, it should be no surprise that we're having this conversation about the necessity of these kinds of reforms, because the race disparities that have been built into law enforcement have been historic, and they are beyond question at this point. I just want to start off by thanking Holly Mitchell for her longstanding engagement on these issues. And I've worked with her personally on these issues, and she has been a champion on these issues in every single role that I've been familiar with, and working with her for over a decade now, from when I was a prosecutor. And so having these conversations and having this kind of leadership is important. I always like to begin these conversations by validating the significance of it, because I think oftentimes we have communities that hear these conversations and they tune out, or they don't listen, or they're not clear as to whether or not they're so necessary. But we are benefited greatly in California by having a RIPA report, and that's the Racial and Identity Profiling Act, that actually records what law enforcement does throughout the state. And so we already know that there are records and reports that anyone can look up in their county or in the state to confirm that of the 1 out of 10 people that are stopped by law enforcement, which are white, against the 1 out of 4 people that are stopped that are in the Latinx community, versus 1 out of 5 people from the African American community that are stopped. Oh, I think I've switched up the Black and brown, because the African Americans are more. But the bigger issue in looking at a report like this, and I like to reference the reports that come out every year on RIPA, because they are facts and evidence. And I like facts and evidence because you don't get to argue with them in terms of what they show. And what they show, and I'll just start with this and won't dwell too deeply on all of this, but 85% of all of the stops that don't lead to an arrest or any law enforcement action, and don't lead to anything confiscated or taken from the subject that could be illegal, are Black and brown folks in the state of California that are handcuffed. So 85% of the people that are detained and handcuffed do not lead to any criminal action and don't yield any criminal purpose. That's over 400,000 hours of public safety hours wasted away. But the real cost is the 85% of those individuals from Black and brown communities that are detained and handcuffed for no reason, that yield no benefit to public safety. And these are just facts. I'm not making them up. You can look them up yourself. But knowing and understanding this is one of the bases that we have to address when we say that we want reform, that we want progress, that we have to do something. And one of the things that we can do is vote, but beyond just voting, because I do believe in advocacy, we can't fix what we don't talk about. And so it's conversations like this. And I thank you for always raising these complicated issues for us to talk about so that people can do better and understand more what the real needs are and the cost that we're paying, not just in how communities of color and disenfranchised communities are treated, but in the wasted efficiencies for the man hours and the cost to validate or to sustain race disparate outcomes. That is the real call. And I think the first step to answering those calls is to voting effectively to address the issues like Holly Mitchell just raised, because that fiscal cost is something that is real. And we are, with our tax dollars, maintaining systems that have race disparate outcomes. And that is absolutely unacceptable. That is something that we can be taking steps towards right now to address. And beyond just the voting, and I'll wrap up with this, but I just want to say, beyond just voting, we can, with our own voices, be demanding and asking of our elected and appointed leaders, what are our race disparities in law enforcement? Do we have reformed advocacy in our own city and counties? Do we have reformed use of force policies? Because even something as simple as that, and most law enforcement agencies, more than 2/3 of them in this nation, don't have reformed use of force policies, which means by adoptive admission, they are still allowed to use carotid techniques. Those are the neck techniques that we saw in George Floyd. They're still allowed to shoot at cars. They're still allowed to use no-knock warrants subjectively, and obviously those interpretations and those uses are in a race disparate way as well. And these are the questions that we can ask in an email. These are the questions that we can ask at a police commission or at a rally, or to walk into an elected official's office like your mayor, like your chief of police, and ask, why are we not collecting race data in our practices? And if we are, why aren't we making that data transparent or analyzing it so that we can do better? These are simple things, but I always like to talk about solution-based orientation beyond just, I voted, what more can I do? We can inform ourselves. We can follow and track some of these measures. And to answer your question in terms of how they can track some of those things, I make every bit of work that I do publishable. And so anyone can go to the website for my agency that manages both law enforcement and deputies as well, because we do the jails here as well, to see what that work looks like and to have ideas about what can be done in other counties. I try to make everything readily available so no one has to reinvent the wheel when they say, we want to buckle down and address concerns in my city and my county, but I don't live in San Francisco. Please feel free to replicate this work, because I think it's really important. And I'm just grateful for this conversation so that we can talk about how important these things are and how it's related to the political ongoing work that's leading us into the midterms with proposals and bills like this that are going to be on our ballot, that are actually on our ballot.
Really,
and if I could just add, you know, if you live in LA County, we have a civilian oversight commission. Go to the LA County Board of Supervisors website, my website, find the link to find out what actions civilians, perhaps your own family, friends, and neighbors who have been appointed to this commission, who are doing this hard work on behalf of every Angelino every day. And I couldn't agree with Mr. Henderson enough. You know, these are also the questions to ask the candidates who are asking for your vote. It's not enough to simply vote and say, well, I've done my part. But before you cast that vote, make sure you're clear about where the candidate stands on these pressing issues. And I may share my own bias. You know, all politics are local. And, you know, as he stated, your mayor, your county supervisor, your sheriff, your district attorney, those are the people who are empowered, quite frankly, to affect laws, to operationalize laws that probably have more direct impact on our lives every day than any other level of government, quite frankly. And so it's up to all of us to be engaged, do our homework, and be informed voters.
Yeah.
I would say that one of the ways to stay informed is having conversations like this. For those of you that are listening to this conversation and feeling like, wow, I actually learned something. Wow, I didn't know that was going on. Take the effort to use your social media and post about the conversations you've heard or the personalities that you've encountered, because we can't expect others to care more about our values than we do. And when we take those secondary steps to post the conversations, to post the facts or post the profiles or information about these agencies and this work, we inform our friends, our families, our neighbors, our peers, not just as to what our values are, but as to what we've learned and what we can inform them about so that they can take better actions and do better and make better decisions too. I really think stuff like that is important. And that's another thing that we can do in Twitter, separate from we can also withdraw. But if we are going to participate in Twitter, making sure that our voices are heard loudly and disseminated widely with things that we value or that are important to us. And this is just one of the ways that we can be doing that. And so, again, I thank you guys for these kind of conversations, because they really do matter and they translate into an informed electorate, into an informed community. And that's always a better situation for us all to be in.
Thank you both for very thoughtful responses as folks prepare to go to the polls on November 8th or prepare to drop off their vote by mail ballots, but it is election season. And you are providing us with a lot of really helpful information. And so I want to ask you this before we wrap things up. And consider this sort of like the lightning round, right? Because we only have a few more minutes. But in a minute, Paul, can you tell us what difference is having a Black mayor, a Black district attorney, a Black police chief, and a Black executive director of the Department of Police Accountability? What difference has that made in terms of delivering on reform and accountability in the city and county of San Francisco? I know the people of Los Angeles are considering two very different individuals for the job of mayor. I'm talking about Congresswoman Karen Bass and Rick Caruso. Karen Bass has the lead, but for voters that are wondering what difference does it make having a Black mayor, you've had a front row seat. Can you tell us in a minute what difference it's made?
Yeah, and I can sum it up very easily. It's something that I think is very important, and it's called cultural competency. And cultural competency at the seat of power makes a difference. It makes a difference in how we understand race disparities. It makes a difference in how we understand economic disparities. And it makes a difference in how we disseminate power and authority around and below us. So when you have those folks in those powerful positions and they are making policy, they are establishing economic goals, having that level of cultural competency levels the playing field in ways that have not existed before, because we have been shut out of the rooms. We've been restricted from the tables. We've been marginalized in the execution of power and authority in so many ways that having that as a possibility matters. And that also makes the distinction, because we have some national campaigns that are going on where we don't have cultural competency. And I'll raise Herschel Walker as the issue. That's what I'm talking about, that every face that looks like us is not necessarily for us and supporting us. And it's the level and the issue of cultural competency that makes a difference. And that's what voters should be looking for. That doesn't mean that we can't have allies, but that issue is one that I think is highly important when we're evaluating candidates, at least to me.
That's right. All skin folk ain't kin folk. We got it. In about a minute.
Yeah, that part.
In about a minute, Supervisor Mitchell, what's your closing argument to LA County voters across the state of California and Black voters across the nation? In about a minute, what's your closing argument?
First of all, let me thank KBLA for being our progressive voice in Los Angeles. I'm so proud of the work that Tavis has done, and I'm proud that you give us a platform to have these critical conversations during election time and any time of year. So hats off to you, Tavis, and KBLA. Registered voters should have received their ballot. People think about Election Day as a single day, but it's not. it's the end of the line. I voted already. Early voting takes place in LA County, and so people can vote tomorrow leading up. You should think of November 8th as the last possible day to exercise your fundamental right. If you don't know where to go, if you didn't get a vote by mail ballot, lavote.gov. There are over 400 ballot drop boxes across LA. Early vote centers are open from 10 to 7, election day 7 to 8. We cannot use the excuse about I didn't know where to go, what to ask for in order to exercise my fundamental right. So I think my last line to people is don't give your power away. People say to me as an elected leader all the time, well, my vote doesn't count, it doesn't make a difference. And my comeback is people wouldn't be working so hard to rob you of that right if it didn't make a difference. And so take the time, exercise your right. If you care about your community, and a colleague of mine used to say, if you didn't vote on Tuesday, don't call my office to complain on Wednesday. And I have adopted that same theory. I am your partner in this. I am working day and night to bring policies and resources and services to people who I believe have been underrepresented and overlooked for far too long. But help me help you, and let's lock our arms and create the kind of county and state and nation we deserve.
Thank you so much to LA County Supervisor, the chair of the LA County Board of Supervisors, Holly J. Mitchell. Also, our thanks to Paul Henderson, the Executive Director of the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability. You've been listening to Agenda for California, an African American perspective. We really hope that you've enjoyed this rich conversation, and we want to thank all of our panelists, all of our dynamic Black leaders on the front lines of change. Thank you for joining us this evening. To California Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, to California State Assembly Member Isaac Bryan, to California State Superintendent of Public Construction, Tony Thurmond. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This program was executive produced by Tavis Smiley. Our board operator is Andy Sayeli. I'm Dr. Nicordelai Corte. All episodes in this special series are available in podcast and video format on KBLA1580.com and on the KBLA app. Thank you so much for tuning in, and be sure to vote by or on Tuesday, November 8th. Have a good evening, everybody. Until next time, stay lifted. More when we come forward.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
I'm Mike Island, and here's the latest from the Black Information Network. Lyft is cutting more than 1/10 of its workers.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for always thinking of me, Nee. How long are you in LA?
I'm in Detroit. It's midnight. I'll call you. All right.